Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers, because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button, and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems, because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up, and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. Today, my guest is Momo Vuyisich. He's the founder and chief science officer at Viome, V-I-O-M-E. I've spoken to Naveen Jain in the past, also part of Viome, and I think they're just such a fascinating company doing so many great things with the microbiome. I wanted to, speak to more of their personnel, so hence today's call with Momo. So welcome, Momo. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background and then how you came to Viome, and then we'll go into Viome after that.
Well, my background is a science, so I got my PhD in biochemistry, undergraduate degree in microbiology, and I experienced as a young man an autoimmune disease that could not be diagnosed. It was basically my immune system was hyperactive and it was attacking my own body all over the place, and my body was deteriorating over time slowly. It was a very slow acting disease, but after a decade, basically my joints were starting to deteriorate and my soft tissues were starting to get really bad. I absolutely was convinced that it had to do something with my diet or lifestyle or some environmental factor. I knew that it was not genetics, and so I never gave up trying different diets and looking up scientific literature to see what it could be. And after a frustrating trial and error for many years of trying every fad diet that you can think of, I finally realized what was causing the autoimmunity. And it's actually a sugar that is found in all mammalian food products that is called Neu5Gc. So I'm going to spell it. It's Neu5Gc. And I think it may be a very common reason for autoimmune disease and joint problems and, any kind of sort of arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis type symptoms. And so I encourage all the audience to just look up Neu5Gc and, inflammation and so on. And there are now quite a few articles about this, but early on, a couple of decades ago, I realized that this was the problem, or it was likely the problem. I removed all mammalian food products from my diet and I completely stopped having symptoms, and my body healed over a period of about 12 months. And I've just been completely disease-free for many, many years. It's been wonderful. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that I became disillusioned with both pharma and academia. Basically, when you're a scientist, you're likely going to end up either in academia or pharma. And the society believes that those two large systems that we've built and that are well-funded are actually improving human health, when in fact that is not the case for the most part. It's not an absolute statement, but the vast majority of research going on in academia does not in fact improve my health or your health or anyone's health. Researchers in academia are incentivized by publications, and those publications don't have to improve anyone's health. And then pharma doesn't even try to improve anyone's health. That's not their business model. Their business model is to manage your illness for as long as they can and charge you as much money per year as they can. That's their business model. And so I just want to make sure that people realize that I don't think academics and pharma people are evil. It's just the system is set up that way. The incentives in academia are to publish papers. The incentive in academia is not to improve my health. And the incentive in pharma is to make as much money as possible out of people. And if you cure someone, well, you're not going to make much money out of it. And so the systems are set up that way. And people who belong to these systems, they play by those incentivization rules. But I realized I didn't want to be a part of any of that. And I don't want to live my life. We get a sliver of, Earth's evolution to live through. And I don't want to waste it on either academia or pharma, in my opinion. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to develop an institute of some kind or some kind of an entity that's going to actually solve the problem of chronic diseases and cancers. And so I was at that time at a government national lab. So for 6 years, I worked there to develop the underlying technology. And then we patented that technology and we spun out Viome. And Naveen Jain, who was on your podcast before, became our CEO and a major investor. And I became the chief science officer. And then we recruited Guru Banavar from IBM. He was the chief architect for IBM Watson and all of those AI systems at IBM. And he joined us as the CTO. And that's the formation of the company. And the company, even though it's a for-profit company, we really, every breath we take, every thought we have, our mission is to improve health of humanity. That is the objective. That is what drives our decisions, what drives our product development, everything under the guise of a for-profit business.
All right, so let's get into Viome itself. So what is the premise of Viome that makes it different from other microbiome companies? Like, I can go to the store, there's, 50 different, probiotics I could take. So what is different about Viome's approach and how it does things?
Yeah, so first of all, one difference is that we are not a microbiome company. We are a systems biology company. So if you go to our website, you will see that we not only analyze the stool samples, but we analyze saliva and blood. And one realization that I had many years before we started Viome was that the human body's health or disease is determined by many factors. And that includes nutrition, other environmental factors, the gut microbiome, oral microbiome, our immune system, our genetics, our inflammatory pathways, our neurotransmitters, our hormones. All of those things combined create whether we are in a healthy state or not. And so anyone who says, well, I'm going to study genetics and that's going to be the root cause of everything, they're wrong. Anyone who says, I'm going to study the gut microbiome because that's where the root cause of all the illness is, that's not the case. Nutrition, that's not the case. It's really interactions of all of these things combined. And that's why our favorite product today on the market is something that combines stool, blood, and saliva analysis. So that's one major differentiator.
What are you getting from stool? It's a proxy for the gut microbiome, saliva for the oral microbiome, blood, I guess the blood microbiome. So why do these three? What are you seeing that you wouldn't get from just doing stool?
Yeah, we don't study the microbiome of the blood yet, keyword yet, but not yet. So the other foundational and fundamental difference between us and all other so-called gut microbiome companies is that we don't look at the same things that other companies do. So the entire field of gut microbiome started with understanding the composition of the microbiome with the premise that it's the composition. If you have certain bacteria, you will be sick, and if you have certain other healthy bacteria, you will be healthy. And that foundational premise, I believe, is wrong, meaning that almost anyone can have a healthy microbiome, but they can also have a sick microbiome depending on the interactions of that gut microbiome with nutrition mostly, but also with the host, aka the person. And so our test is fundamentally very different from all other gut microbiome or oral microbiome or blood tests on the market, completely fundamentally different. And here's the difference. The difference is that we're measuring the biochemical functions of both microbial genes in stool and saliva and human genes in blood. And let me give you an example of why that is important. So let's say a person is born, we do a genetic test, and we say, wow, this person has a 9% higher chance of developing IBD based on the genetics. What is that person going to do based on that information? How are they going to change their lifestyle or anything? They can't. They're just like, well, crap, I have a higher chance of developing IBD. That sucks, but I can't do anything about it. That's just my genetics, right? Now, whether they have a very small chance of developing IBD, even though they have an increased chance, but once they develop IBD, if they do, they can go back to that test and say, well, the test told me that I had a higher chance of developing it. Still, that test doesn't tell me anything now that I've been diagnosed with IBD, what to do about it, right? It just told me that there's a high risk. So to me, DNA has very, very, very severe limitation in terms of actionability. There's basically very little to nothing that you can do based on the DNA. Also, if you understand how IBD works, which is the case with many chronic diseases, they go through flares and remissions stages. And so with IBD, it's a classic example. A person who has been diagnosed with IBD, they will be in a remission most of the time, but every once in a while they'll enter a flare, meaning during remission, they're healthy. They can go eat anything. They can do any social activities. They can go hike. They can do whatever they want. But when they hit a flare, their intestines inflame, and now they're in pain 24 hours a day. They have many diarrheas per day. They can't function as a human being. If you sequence their DNA, their genome, during the remission and flare, their genome is identical. Their DNA doesn't change, meaning that the exact same DNA can make them healthy and can make them sick. So why would that be useful?
Well, I mean, there's epigenetics, both as I understand in bacteria and in human cells. So, and then there's latency of certain viruses and, probably of bacteria as well. So, I mean, how could it just be genetics? So it seems existing factors, environmental factors to it.
Exactly. It's not genetics. And I basically gave an example. It's not genetics because you have the same DNA when you're sick and when you're healthy. So it can't be genetics. But if you look at gene expression of the intestines, and this has been done by several groups, if you look at the expression of genes, meaning which human genes are actually active during the inflammatory period of flare versus normal healthy period of remission, you will see that the activation of the genes is very different. It's black and white, basically. And that's been published. And the same thing on the microbial side. A person has the same microbiome when they go through the cycles of remission and relapse. However, the microbes are performing different biochemical functions during remission and relapse. And so we really need to focus on the biochemical functions of both microbes and our own genes instead of just the sequence, which is what everyone else is doing.
Okay.
I have a couple of other unique things about Viome. Should we go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Another very unique thing about the Viome platform, we call it Nutrition 2.0, and I encourage all readers to go to Google and search Viome Nutrition 2.0. We described this in an article, in a blog article, although we did describe it in a peer-reviewed publications last fall. It's the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine, so we described that as well, but much more technical jargon. But basically, Nutrition 2.0 not only incorporates our test, that's what I call the biochemistry of the human body, but it incorporates mathematical algorithms that actually translate those biochemical data into personalized nutritional recommendations for every person, so that when you're told to minimize tofu and minimize black beans, but you can actually enjoy lentils and you can enjoy chickpeas, that is actually based on your biological data. It is not based on some tables that represent the entire human population. It is not based on guesses and past experiences. It is literally 100% based on your biological data at that point of time in your life.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show.
And so the example I gave in my life, up until now, my ability of the gut microbiome to process oxalates from tofu or soybeans and black beans has been good. So I've been able to eat as much of those as I wanted to, and I balanced those with lentils and chickpeas. But the most recent test that I did with Viome told me that, now your gut microbiome is starting to slow down the processing of oxalates, which are essentially plant toxins. And now the computer automatically adjusts my recommendations and says you should consider minimizing tofu and minimizing black beans, but you can now eat more of lentils and chickpeas. There's no possible way for any nutritionist or any other nutritional expert or nutritional scientist to know that unless they perform our test and they measure exactly what the microbiome is doing. And so this is really what we call data-driven, AI-computed, personalized nutritional recommendations. And data-driven means they're fully dependent on you and your data and nothing to do with the human race.
I took what do they call it? They evaluate which foods you have allergies to. So they gave me a list of, they looked at supposedly 1,000 different things, and they told me certain things were, I should not have, certain things I have less of, certain things are fine. Like, I know one for me was amaranth and, strange stuff like mackerel. What about those tests? Are those anywhere close to the efficacy you guys get or the resolution on particular food?
Great question, great topic. So let's go back to my statement that the human body's health and disease is determined by many factors. And one of those factors is, does our immune system have the health to recognize what is a food and not respond to it and just let it be, or it is somehow unhealthy and recognizes certain foods as antigens or pathogens, and it responds by creating an inflammatory response. And food sensitivity and food allergy tests are a great way to probe the reaction of the immune system to different foods. And those are completely complementary to our tests, which is why my family has been not only doing the Viome test for years, but has been doing the food sensitivity test from Everly Well for years, every year. And because they're complementary, they're probing different parts of the human body. And so food sensitivity tests, you mentioned food allergy, those are IgE-mediated responses, and those would be very violent and very rapid, meaning right after you eat something, an hour later, you would have a very violent reaction. IgG responses are called food sensitivities, and they tend to be taking a longer time, like 24 to 72 hours, and the response is not going to be violent. It can be a skin rash, or it can be some kind of joint pain, or it can be some kind of brain fog.
I felt those from different foods.
Right.
Like I have when I have either pork pineapple, and I look this up, it's a certain protein in them, my mouth will itch. It doesn't swell up. I don't die or anything. Depending on the pork or the pineapple, if it's not cooked right, itch like crazy. It's not like, what's going on here? But it stops there. But I can see it could be far worse, obviously.
Right. So yeah, for those tests, the only one that I recommend is the one from Well. I know that there are a bunch of companies out there that are promoting these tests that have no scientific backing of how those tests work, and I am absolutely convinced that they're scammers. So I would be very careful about those tests.
Okay, yeah, but I'm not saying like some of the reactions that I've gotten are not as bad, but I have like a friend that, if he eats a shrimp, it'll kill him. His throat will close up. So yeah, I can see there's a huge difference in risk depending on the food and the person and all that, yeah.
And then, since you delved into this topic, I just want to mention that, if people have health issues, not only should they do things like Viome tests to fine-tune their nutrition based on their microbiome and human interactions and inflammatory systems, I recommend also these food sensitivity tests, like I mentioned from Well, but also they may want to consider doing mycotoxin tests. They might consider heavy metal tests. They might consider doing hormone tests. All of these are like major contributors to human health. And of course, all these things cost money and they're not covered by insurance. And the mainstream, medicine does not recognize those as, necessarily useful. So do as much as you can to the best of your ability, because these days, I recommend everyone take their own health in their own hands. And while I'm not discouraging anyone from going to a doctor, explore that to the max, but also consider other alternative options that are not included in the medical system, because they may provide you with an answer that you're looking for.
Fair enough. Okay. So what happens when I have a food that gives me an allergic reaction, either a very strong one or one that's lesser and takes time? Like, why do some people, let's say when they have gluten, immediately they're like, and they're out for days, and some people a day or two later, all of a sudden they're hurting.
Yeah, all of these are inflammatory responses, meaning that the immune system thinks that these foods are going to cause you harm. As you know, when we get sick from a pathogen like, SARS-CoV-2 virus or influenza virus or any kind of pathogen, our immune system is there to defend us and to clear the pathogen. We have systems in place called food tolerances that are supposed to recognize foods as something that we should tolerate, and the immune system should not be reacting to foods. But when a balance between the microbiome, the foods, and our immune system is not correct, then our immune system can recognize certain foods as immunogenic or pathogenic, and then the immune system will respond, and that's when we get symptoms. And so we currently, scientists do not know the exact root cause of how is it that the immune system all of a sudden starts recognizing certain foods as pathogens. There's lots of evidence that the gut microbiome is interacting with the immune system in the gut and teaching the immune system that these are foods, and so be tolerant to them. And when that communication breaks down, there is a problem. But we literally don't, like today, if I am sensitive to a certain food, I cannot do anything about it to cure it. The only thing I can do is stop eating those foods for some time and hope that I will lose that immune response.
Well, I've heard some people with peanut allergy, one strategy is to give them minute amounts of peanut slowly over time and give them more and more and more. And that's one way to, condition the person to not have this reactivity. Yeah. Have we all explored that? And why would that work as a mechanism?
Yeah, no, we don't explore that. We only make nutritional recommendations. There's been a nice trial in Australia to show that can work for some people to some degree, but it does work for all people. And so it's basically, if you want to try it, you would have to go to a doctor who's willing to fiddle with that. But no, that's not something that we are pursuing at this moment.
Okay. And I got a question about, I don't even know if it's a sensible question, but who eats first? When I eat food, is it bacteria eat a little bit of it, then they pass it back to my cells, and then my cells change it, and then they pass it back to the bacteria? Like, what's it like, do you think?
All of the above. So there are certain reactions that are taking place, meaning digestion, right in the mouth. So right in the mouth, we are releasing enzymes that start the digestion of certain polysaccharides. And right in the mouth, we have a very complex and rich oral microbiome, which is also starting to digest our foods. And so we have processing of certain foods right in the oral microbiome. And then in the small intestine is where the stomach and the small intestine is where the majority of the digestion happens by us, by acids and by different digestive enzymes. And so the majority of the food gets absorbed in the small intestine. And then whatever doesn't get absorbed in the small intestine enters the the large intestine, which is where the majority of the bacterial or microbial processing of that food happens. And that processing of that food both feeds the gut microbiome, but also that microbiome outputs chemicals or metabolites that influence our health or disease. So it's really a very interactive process that has evolved over time.
But can anyone tell, is there a metabolic, let's say my cells go to work on a particular food item and they create like an intermediate compound. And now all of a sudden that's available to one of my bacteria. And that bacteria eats it and changes it to something else. It's ready again for my cells to work on it. And is there this back and forth? Like how intricate, does anyone have any idea of the cooperation between, our microbiome and ourselves?
Yeah, we do have lots of ideas and there's lots of data. It doesn't go back and forth that many times, but for example, with the nitrate metabolism, what'll happen is that the gut bacteria will process the nitrate into nitrites. Nitrites will, via the bloodstream, go to the oral cavity where they can get turned into nitrous oxide. And that nitrous oxide can also be produced by our human cells in the gut using different enzymes. So there is some interactions, but they're not multi-step. I would say the first dibs are either microbial or human, and then someone else may get second dibs, but it's not many times back and forth. But it's definitely interactive in terms of what the microbiome produces very much affects our health and our disease. And to a very large extent, what we produce, especially in the gut, affects the behavior of the establishment of the healthy microbiome and then maintenance of that. So let me give you an example. A significant portion of calories that a mother produces in breast milk cannot be digested by the baby. They're specifically evolved to feed specific members of the gut microbiome such that we actually intentionally, evolutionarily stimulate specific members of the gut microbiome to take foothold in the gut microbiome and then both maintain and develop our immune system and prevent pathogens from coming in. How cool is that?
Yeah, I've heard certain, oligosaccharides. Yeah,
exactly, huge amount of oligosaccharides. So that's one early example, but there are many other examples where, for example, one recent example that I love to give is that, everyone knows people who get sick repeatedly and everyone knows people who don't get sick repeatedly. Our immune system has the ability to memorize when we get sick so that we don't get sick again from the same pathogen. And so it should work in everyone. It turns out that there's a chemical signaling made by a compound called butyrate that tells the immune system to convert into a memory immune system for that pathogen. And so the way it works is that at the time at which you're fighting a pathogen, our T cells that are fighting the pathogen are either going to die or they're going to be converted to memory T cell. If we eat specific foods with specific fibers that feed specific members of our gut microbiome in the colon, they will produce this compound butyrate, and during illness, that butyrate will translocate to the bloodstream and signal the T cells not to die, but to in fact convert to memory T cells so that next time you encounter that pathogen, you will clear it quickly and you will not get sick. How cool is that?
Yeah, no, that's amazing.
That is amazing. Exactly. So people who don't eat fiber or who have lost the members of the gut microbiome that produce butyrate, when they're sick, they can get sick again because they basically lost the memory of that infection.
The company name is Viome. It sounds to me kind of like Virome. I know this is an unbelievably complex system. Do you look at any of the phage activity associated with different bacteria and, how does that affect us? How does that interact with our cells?
In terms of viruses, we specifically today, our AI algorithms look at the plant viruses. We currently do not integrate any of the mycophages or bacteriophages into our nutritional recommendations. That does not mean that they will not come in the future. We just have not learned yet how to incorporate them so far.
Okay. So does anyone understand the interaction of, bacteriophages and our phages, if there is any, or, how they may influence our cells and how our cells may influence theirs? Then there's also exosomes too, and it's a craziness. I don't know how anyone can model this. It's unbelievable,
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It is extraordinarily complex, and we're chiseling away bits and pieces as we can. So we have not focused on exosomes. However, we have focused on one part of exosomes, which is LPS, so lipopolysaccharide production by the gram-negative bacteria in the colon. We have a very good LPS production score, and that LPS production, most audience will probably not know that LPS can be very pro-inflammatory, and that is what it's known for, but there are LPS components that can actually be anti-inflammatory. And so you really need to enumerate or account for all of the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory in order to get an overall sort of score, which is what we provide to our customers. So in terms of exosomes, we do that. In terms of phages and viruses, so let's just clear up the nomenclature a little bit. There is bacteriophage macrophages, which are viruses that infect only bacteria. There's mycophages, which are viruses that only infect fungi. And then there are viruses, and viruses can be either human viruses or plant viruses. And we have all four types in the human gut. And like I said, the only ones that we have included so far in nutritional recommendations are plant viruses. We have some data on that. We have not yet included human viruses because human viruses, basically, if you have a norovirus, you will have diarrhea for 5 to 10 days, and you probably shouldn't be doing any kind of a Viome test during that time because your gastrointestinal system will be deeply disturbed. And then bacteriophages and mycophages, to a smaller degree, they are actually very much balancing the microbiome and creating this dynamic equilibrium in the gut microbiome that is what is actually generating the functional output that we depend on. And so recently we learned, for example, not only that bacteriophages affect the composition of the gut microbiome in terms of relative abundances of different microorganisms, but they actually can stimulate a specific bacterium to produce or to express certain genes or not, which means that they affect the function of those bacteria, which can then affect our health and disease. So all of these bits and pieces are important. The way to actually solve this problem is to not try to solve the entire problem all at once because you will fail. It's just too big of a problem. The best way to solve this problem is to start with the largest contributors, solve those first, and then go for other pieces. That's been our approach, and I think it's the right approach.
Okay. Anything close to a breakthrough in understanding in terms of this whole dynamic? Like the way forward, it's just going to require like very sophisticated AI models to even kind of approximate what's going on inside our bodies, or are we making any headway? Like, what are you seeing?
Yeah, we're making a huge headway. I mean, so today, see, what we have focused on at Viome is two things. Let's break down those two things. This is very important. This is like one of the main takeaways. The one thing is, the question is, when a microorganism in the gut microbiome or oral microbiome makes a metabolite during its own life, what is the effect of that metabolite on the human health? Is it promoting healthy human body? Is it actually causing a disease, or is it neutral? That's the first question. And how do we get to that question? We do vast amounts of clinical research where we specifically generate lots of data and use AI models to ask this question so that we can identify what are the microbial functions that output specific chemicals that are good for us or bad for us? For example, going back to the couple of examples I gave you, butyrate has been established as one of the most beneficial compounds that is made in the large colon by the gut microbiome. And so we want all of our customers to increase butyrate production. That's a goal. Now, the other one would be, for example, pro-inflammatory LPS. We don't want bacteria to produce LPS because that is going to activate our immune system and activate inflammation, and we will feel sick. And so that's step one, identifying what microbial and human gene functions are associated with health and which ones are associated with disease. Step number two is to now develop a set of personalized nutritional recommendations that convert the biochemical data into nutritional recommendations that minimize the production of bad chemicals, those that are associated with diseases, and maximize the production of healthy chemicals, those that are associated with health. So that's basically the two-step process. And we have invested tens of millions of dollars at Viome to do the clinical research in order to learn what's good for people and what's bad for people, and then to develop this Nutrition 2.0 platform that converts the biochemical data into personalized nutritional recommendations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it is maybe a way out there question, but we have our 5 senses. Do we know what the senses are of bacteria, for instance, like, maybe chemotaxis, pressure, etc.?
That's a fantastic question.
Well, the reason why I ask is, people say, your gut instinct, trust your gut, etc. The gut is a second brain. I would guess at the very least that the sensory apparatus of our complete microbiome acts as a 6th, 7th, 8th sense that maybe we haven't characterized, but we benefit from. That's why we have these feelings, these intuitions, these, pains, etc. What are your thoughts?
Fantastic question. We could literally have a podcast on that question. That's how fantastic that question is. But let's summarize here what we know. So what I would like everyone in the audience to understand is that our body is all about chemical sensing. So forget about the senses that we interpret as senses, like sense of smell. That's a derivative sense that we comprehend as conscious human beings, right? But in terms of sensing, every single thing that happens in our body is based on certain chemical inputs. And so I described one specific example, a T cell that is reacting to COVID virus. It literally will die unless it senses the presence of butyrate. If it senses the presence of butyrate, it'll say, oh, I need to convert to a memory T cell. That's a sense, right? And we do not translate that sense in our mind as any sort of a sense that we would interpret because it's a chemical sensing, but that chemical sensing occurs at hundreds of thousands of levels and layers at this moment in all of our bodies. And so I can list many, many of those. Now, because we have our own senses that we interpret as smell and vision and so on, feelings and so on, the reason why those are created, and some of those are created in the gut, is because of neurotransmission that occurs from the gut directly to the brain via the vagus nerve. So I encourage all readers to read about the generation of neurotransmitters in the gut and then the translation of that signal via the vagus nerve directly to our brain. So that's one way to where if you eat something that's not good for you, you can get nausea. And nausea is definitely a feeling. On the other hand, you can actually convert what you see with your hands or what you hear via the vagus nerve down into the gut and actually cause problems. And so this is a classic example for that two-way communication between the gut and the brain. This is called a gut-brain axis, would be the disease called IBS. IBS is as much of a microbiome disease as it is a mental sort of anxiety disease. And it's all driven by neurotransmitter dysfunction in the gut feeding the vagus nerve to the brain, but also your brain thinking about things and sending the signals back to the gut. And so that's why both nutrition and some kind of cognitive therapy can help with a disease like IBS. So yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and that's the summary.
Okay. I guess last question or two. What's ahead that you can talk about for Viome over the next year or two?
Well, we have focused over the last few years on specific diseases, and these are depression, anxiety, IBS, and type 2 diabetes. And not only did we do lots of research and spent lots of money and developed AI algorithms for all these diseases, we have converted all of that knowledge into nutritional recommendations that all of our customers benefit from. And currently we're running randomized controlled trials to test the ability of our nutritional recommendations to improve those conditions. So that's currently what's really hot. But right now we're adding IBD to that. So we just published IBS, depression, anxiety, and type 2 diabetes papers in the last 6 months to a year. And now we're focused on IBD. Everything is powered by money. And so once we have enough money, we're going to expand this to mild cognitive impairment and aging and Parkinson's and all of multiple sclerosis, ALS, all other diseases. So just one after another, we're going to focus on chronic diseases. Basically, our mission is to put chronic diseases and cancers into history books. So today we read about the Black Plague and we say, wow, there was this horrible disease that killed, a third of the population of the world back in the 14th century. But we don't wake up today thinking, crap, am I going to die of Black Plague or not, right? But back in the 14th century, you woke up and you thought, man, am I going to die today of the Black Plague or not? And if you did, that was bad luck. And if you didn't, that was good luck, right? We literally had no clue what was the root cause of these disease. Today, we're in the exact same status for multiple sclerosis, for Alzheimer's, for every type of cancer, for every type of chronic disease. We literally don't know what causes it. And Viome's mission, every breath we take, is to identify the root cause of these diseases so we can basically prevent them and not have them. So that my grandkid can read on Wikipedia that there was this disease called multiple sclerosis that people suffered from every single day of their life. And yet today, no one has it anymore because we now know what causes it. We can prevent it and nobody has it. And the same with all other diseases.
Okay. Well, very good. So for listeners, where can they go to start engaging with Viome and to get their personal assessment and their food recommendations and everything? Like, what's a good starting point?
Yeah, so if they want to buy commercial products, that's Viome.com, Viome.com. If they want to explore more science, we have ViomeLifeSciences.com website where we have quite an extensive set of research blogs where they can read. But, you can ask ChatGPT about different topics. You can Google. If you have any kind of scientific background, you can go to NCBI and search the scientific literature. The amount of information right now is truly overwhelming. Until a few years ago, I could keep up with all of the literature that had to do with the human physiology and systems biology. Today, that would be absolutely impossible to do. The growth has been exponential. So there's tons of information. So it just depends on what the person is looking for. Are they looking for general knowledge about what are the microbial functions that are important in human health? Go look for review articles on NCBI. So there's tons of resources.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Momo, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a very complex issue, but it's really fascinating, and we still haven't gotten into nearly all the complexity. It's insane. I was going to ask you about biofilms and how gene expression changes within a biofilm and how it interacts in the body, and but like I said, there's many rabbit holes to go down. But
many rabbit holes to go down, yes.
Yeah, but thank you again for coming on the podcast, and I look forward to continuing to speak to Viome and you and all the other people there, and keep pace on your development.
Thank you for promoting.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.